I have always wanted to talk about queer culture in ancient China, but as it turns out, it's extremely complicated. Wikipedia defines the term queer as an umbrella term for sexual and gender minorities that are not heterosexual or gender binary. And despite the use of minorities, queer people and their culture have always existed throughout human history. China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, and without a doubt, we have our own share of queer culture. However, as much as I would like to tackle the topic straight away, I have come to realize that it's impossible to carry on without getting entangled in other social issues that have dominated the public discussion throughout Chinese history. So in this video, instead of giving you factual contents on Asian Chinese queer culture, I would like to touch on some of the most prominent reasons on why we cannot simply talk about queer culture in ancient China as it is. In other words, the queer issue is not just a queer issue. It's not a queer issue, it's a class issue. Human history is often dominated by the narrative of the ruling class, and that's why we tend to know more about kings, queens, and generals rather than, say, tailors, maids, and eunuchs. So if we look carefully into Chinese history, we would definitely see more emperors and government officials engaging in non-heterosexual activities than ordinary citizens. Note that this does not mean that only upper-class people are gay. I seriously don't see any relation between the two. I mean, being rich and powerful does not make you gay, and being gay, of course, does not make you rich and powerful by default. But because our narrow perspective we get from reading the detailed lives of famous historical figures, and we just tend to think that somehow their sexuality is directly affected by or directly affects their lifestyle. Because the stories are always about rich and powerful people who can afford to have multiple sex partners, and regardless of their genders. And of course, when they get so in love, they would shower their partners with all the money and positions they can afford. And then you have corruption. But if you think harder, it really has nothing to do with the gender of the partner. Because emperors in ancient China have repeatedly made the mistake of promoting scummy people from their wives' families or building grand palaces just to amuse their favorite women. And let's put it this way. When emperors are blinded by their affection for a lover, they will do anything to please them, whatever gender they may be. So if anyone thinks homosexuality has anything to do with corruption, they have overlooked the fact that history has always been told from the point of view of the very group of people who are capable of corrupting in the first place. In the meantime, there are definitely a lot of gay people who among ordinary citizens, but the story is very rarely told from their point of view, and only scattered records remained, which I will talk about now. It's not just a queer issue, it's a cultural issue. Asian Chinese don't really bother with the idea of self-identification in that regard. That is to say, people don't really bother declaring their orientation, but rather just go for the person they desire. So what happens is that writers and poets tend to directly describe same-sex love, well, most often between two men, without considering any form of identification. So rather than saying this man is gay, you're more likely to see a statement such as this man likes other men, something of that sort. So it has become more of a behavior issue than an identification issue. And do keep in mind that getting married and have kids is kind of vital for a man, a powerful man especially, in ancient China. So even if they have zero interest in having sex with women, the majority of them still assume the roles of husbands and fathers. And the only way they could embrace their homosexuality is to form intimate relationships with other men, some in the form of a master and servant, as you can see from many emperors' bedrooms, and some in the form of close friends or sworn brothers, and some in the form of stepfathers and stepsons. And the general public also sees this as more of a lifestyle rather than an identity. We have this term, 南风, which literally means the trend of preferring men. and is used to describe some periods of Chinese history when men, mostly upper class men, become obsessed with the idea of having other men as romantic or sexual partners. So it is sometimes very difficult to differentiate whether these people were born with the desire of having sex with men, or they were affected by this fashion or trending practice of having sex with men. Because after all, homosexuality is not an abomination in ancient China, nor in Chinese culture, and the law does not punish homosexuality, and people generally don't give a shit until, there's serious corruption or power abuse going on. Since the public is so tolerant to homosexuality, does that mean ancient China is a queer-friendly place? Of course, if you're a rich and powerful man who's married with children, that wouldn't be a problem at all. Which leads me to the next point. It's not just a queer issue, it's a women's issue. Yes, ancient China does seem to be pretty okay with gay men hanging around, and even in the ruling class. And in last year, Hong Kong's Pride Parade, the host said that China has always been one of the world's most LGBTQ-friendly places, which I sadly disagree. Why? Is it because we don't have marriage equality? I mean, not at all. Because, same-sex couples are not allowed to marry in any Chinese-speaking region on Earth, as for now, but that's not why ancient China is not an LGBTQ-friendly place. Because guess what? Gay men in ancient China don't even have to get married to have equal rights with heterosexual people, and sometimes they have even more rights. In the modern context, marriage equality very often links with other legal rights, such as properties and medical care, etc. But in ancient China, marriage pretty much it just means reproduction, and the reality is, being a wife has far fewer rights than being a male partner of another man, because it was not the sexuality that mattered; it was the gender. Because many male partners of the ruling class got assigned very high-ranking government positions, and they were filthy rich. But a woman, even if she does have power, is almost always affiliated with another man's position. So she has to be an empress, she has to be a dowager, she has to be a wife and mother to assume those roles. So in that sense, even without the modern idea of marriage equality, men, regardless of their orientation or sexual activities, generally have more rights than women. I mean, except if you're a male prostitute, because, it isn't surprising because prostitution historically has always been taboo. But yeah, would you say ancient China is an LGBTQ-friendly place if it's not even women-friendly? And I have better reasons to argue that ancient China is far from LGBTQ-friendly. Why? Because it pretty much is just G-friendly. I mean, highborn men have all the liberties to fuck whoever they want. But what about women? I mean, lesbians are among the most underrepresented social groups in China, and even if there are a few examples of women engaging in same-sex relationships, it is very often seen as rebellion against patriarchy, rather than women embracing their homosexuality. And also due to the fact that women are not allowed to express their sexuality. So if you say you're in love with a woman, people would tend to think that for some reason you just hate men. Therefore, you're in love with a woman, or you like women more. As for bisexuality, like I said before, if people can afford it, very often they would just go both ways. And both partners in the gay relationship are very often married with children, and it's never clear whether they're 100% gay or they fall somewhere on the spectrum. But my impression would be that bisexuality is very ubiquitous and is also underrepresented in the sense that once a person practices homosexuality, people tend to label you as a homosexual even though you're actually bisexual or pansexual. And although homosexuality passes in ancient China, cross-dressing very often is not. Well, yes, of course, there are certain relatively liberal periods in history when it was fashionable for women to dress in men's clothes, such as Tang Dynasty. And somewhere around Jin Dynasty, there was a time when men put on very heavy makeup and tend to act femininely. But the general opinion is still pretty stuck with gender roles. So cross-dressers and trans people tend to be seen as second-class citizens, and some of them who happen to be partners of powerful people may get to enjoy some wealth and influence, but people view them as jesters who, without any actual talent to deserve any actual status. And historians generally tend to see them as actors, entertainers, or clowns, rather than, trans people. So yeah, they're not visible until they have formed a relationship with powerful men. So what I want to get through in this video is that it is terribly problematic to talk about queer culture in Asian China, because Asian Chinese have a very different approach to queerness, and then the culture examines it from a very different perspective. And of course there is oppression and stigma and norms, but here I just wanted to point out that it is impossible to just talk about queer culture in Asian China because it's so deeply embedded in other social issues as well. I'm sorry that I didn't get to dig any deeper. I would love to, but I don't want to make this video too long. It's probably already too long. And I would love to talk more about it in the future. And this is just a start, and that's why I want to clear some important issues out of the way first. Please leave a comment if you have any, and I'll see you next time. For those of you who are wondering, I did do research for this video.